Historically, all migratory movements have brought consequences to the regions that received this population flow. Whether positive or negative, something always changes. However, as the human population reached unprecedented demographic levels from the 19th century onward, human movement increased and filled areas of the planet that were previously empty. And this happened for several reasons. Greater food production led to a larger population. New pharmaceutical technologies and medical knowledge drastically reduced infant mortality and increased life expectancy. New technologies like railways and automobiles made it possible to travel much farther. New engineering processes made it possible to adapt regions that were once inhospitable, and new telecommunication systems reduced the psychological distances between peoples, thus increasing their integration and facilitating the colonization of regions that were previously difficult to access. The Brazilian interior stood out in this aspect. Understand that for centuries, whether as a colony, an empire, or a republic, we remained very limited to the coast in most of the country. But starting from the end of the 19th century, and even more so from the second half of the 20th century, we changed that and began to successfully occupy interior. Now, in the 21st century, we are seeing human movement stand out again, even if to a lesser extent, but still enough to change entire regions. And unlike in the past, now migrations are not just for better professional opportunities, but mainly caused by the high violence in the big cities and by the increasingly unsustainable cost of living, caused mainly by crushing taxes. However, the destination regions simply do not have the conditions to absorb this human movement, leading not only to a huge and rapid increase in property values, whether for rent or sale, but also breaking down urban infrastructure. And the worst part, water crises that are unprecedented in some regions, and two regions seem more vulnerable, either because they suddenly became major destinations for immigrants, or because their infrastructure cannot handle a much larger demographic volume than what exists today. In recent years, Paraná and Santa Catarina have faced severe droughts that have highlighted the water vulnerability of these regions. Between 2020 and 2022, the southern region went through a period of rainfall far below average, associated with the La Niña phenomenon, resulting in a widespread water crisis. At the peak of the drought, at the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, most of Santa Catarina recorded some degree of extreme drought in the west, severe in the center, moderate in the plateau, and only the northern coast and the greater Florianopolis region recorded no drought. This prolonged drought led several municipalities to declare a state of water emergency, with direct impacts both on urban supply and on agricultural production. This drought has become recurrent since 2019, resulting in rainfall deficits of up to 130 millimeters in the region, affecting watercourses and aquifers. In Paraná, the water crisis was also intense. The metropolitan region of Curitiba faced almost 2 years of water rationing, with a rotation between 2020 and 2021 due to the critically low levels of the reservoirs that supply the capital. The Paraná Sanitation Company, Sanepar, warned that without a 20% reduction in consumption, the water could simply run out. In November 2021, even after above-average rainfall in some months, the water supply rotation was maintained initially with 36 hours with water followed by 36 hours without water, and later changing to 24 hours with water and 24 hours without water in the most affected regions. This extreme scenario was deemed the worst in decades. State agencies even use cloud seeding, which is when induction planes release chemical products into rain clouds to try to relieve drought in a certain region. They attempted this in Curitiba, but as with São Paulo in 2014 and 2015, it failed. In July 2021, 8 cities in the southern and southeastern regions were already under a water rationing scheme, including Curitiba and the municipalities in the southwest of Paraná, due to the lowest reservoir levels in decades. This urban water security has even been the focus of attention from the authorities in both states. However, it presents very big challenges. That's because, according to the Water Atlas from the National Water Agency, most municipal centers have only medium or low levels of water security. In Paraná, 52% of the municipalities were classified as having medium or low security, which are the second and third worst levels of Urban Water Security Index, affecting 14% of the state's population. And in Santa Catarina, 58% of the municipal centers had medium or low security, representing 38% of the population of Santa Catarina. In other words, Santa Catarina has more people living in vulnerable areas, especially in the countryside, than Paraná, which is also already in a serious situation. And if we consider the indicators of water availability versus demand, we will see that the greatest risks in Santa Catarina in January 2022 showed that out of the 267 cities that reported their water situation, 99 municipalities, that is, 37%, were in a state of attention, alert, or in a critical state regarding urban supply due to this drought. At the time, 15 Santa Catarina municipalities already faced a critical supply situation, and 17 declared an emergency due to the lack of water, concentrated in the west and far west. In Paraná, the state government declared a water emergency throughout the state at the end of 2021 to speed up contingency measures, with medium-sized cities in western Paraná also implementing water rationing just like in the capital, Curitiba. These cases show that besides the big cities, smaller towns also suffered from the risk of collapse in their water systems. But there is a region that worries me even more. The population growth of Londrina, Maringá, and Apucarana between 2000 and 2024, which are the three main urban centers in northern Paraná, has been enormous over the last 25 years. The population of Londrina grew from around 447,000 residents in 2000 to 556,000 in 2022, a 25% increase. But Maringá grew even more, from 290,000 inhabitants in 2000 to 410,000 residents. In 2022, a demographic increase of almost 42% in 22 years. Apucarana's population grew from 100,000 in 2000 to 130,000 in 2022, a 30% increase over 22 years. For me, who am from Greater São Paulo and used to millions of people, these numbers might even seem low. But 1% of Greater São Paulo, if it were relocated to the north of Paraná, would mean 200,000 more people, which would completely change the region. So these are numbers that are big for this region. And the problematic issue is that in the last 2 decades, the northern region of Paraná has faced frequent and increasingly severe droughts, revealing a very high water stress. Several climate indicators and operational records point to the worsening of water crises, not only because of reduced rainfall, but also because of excessive increases in consumption, obviously related to population growth. Data from the Centro Integrado de Meteorologia e Recursos Hídricos do Paraná meteorological system show that from June 2019 to March 2020, several key cities had rainfall volumes well below the historical average, with an average deficit of 33% in Curitiba, Ponta Grossa, Guarapuava, Maringá, and Londrina. In Londrina in particular, it rained about 30% less than normal during this period. In Maringá, the decrease was 15%, which brings us to the issue of the condition of water sources and supply because major rivers in the southern region and Paraná have very low flow rates during crises. In northern Paraná, Londrina has historically had a relatively comfortable situation because it is supplied by the generous volume of the Tabagi River, but this has been changing very quickly. The prolonged lack of rain, combined with the constant increase in consumption, reduced the level of the Tabagi in 2020 and the city has been accumulating a water deficit since 2018. In 2020 and 2021, water rationing was implemented in dozens of municipalities, although Londrina and Moringa managed to avoid more severe cuts. But this was due much more to political factors than to technical reasons. After all, these are the two richest cities where there are more jobs and so on. But nearby smaller cities are often entering into rationing schemes. And it's not as if it's easy to solve this issue in that region because the geography really works against it. The geographical difficulties for creating large reservoirs in the north of Paraná, so that they would be like the big reservoirs in greater São Paulo, are very significant. Because make no mistake, if São Paulo has those 20 million people and greater Rio de Janeiro has 13 million, it's because of the water supply. The rule is simple. The more water, the more conditions the region has to accommodate people. And if you naturally have little water, you at least need a geography that allows for artificial concentration. And in this sense, the abundance of hills helps these two cities, São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but it doesn't help the north of Paraná. That's because the northern region of Paraná has a relatively flat terrain, only slightly undulating, with few areas of deep valleys or natural gorges that make it easier to build large reservoirs. And the absence of incised valleys limits the formation of large dams, which usually depend on naturally deep areas or areas nestled between elevations to maximize water storage with less surface flooding. In addition, the main rivers in the region, Tibagi, Pirapó, Ivaí, and Paranapanema, have relatively limited volumes compared to large rivers like the Paraná or the Iguaçu, which greatly limits the potential for forming large artificial lakes. Many of these local water courses have variable flow regimes and sometimes low levels during drier periods, greatly reducing their capacity for constant accumulation. But there's still one more factor. This is a wealthy region, and the reason for this wealth is its agricultural and livestock production. The region is occupied by large-scale intensive agricultural activities, and creating large reservoirs would mean flooding economically productive areas, such as fertile land and urban or suburban areas. Besides that, agricultural activity also consumes a lot of water. And it's not like you can just come in and tell them to reduce agriculture, because it's exactly what keeps the region's economic activity high. And why do we have such strong agricultural activity there? Because we have what's called the famous terra roxa soils. They're highly fertile. Actually, this is the most naturally fertile region in the country because of this type of soil. However, this type of soil is highly vulnerable to erosion, which causes the reservoirs to silt up quickly. In other words, reservoirs here quickly accumulate a large amount of sediment and soil. So, building large reservoirs would require additional investments in erosion control throughout the entire watershed, making the projects much more expensive. And to face these challenges, the National Water and Basic Sanitation Agency Atlas, the National Water and Basic Sanitation Agency, estimated that Paraná will need more than 5 billion reais by 2035 for new water production and distribution projects, which would be the highest amount in the south, and Santa Catarina will need about 4 billion in the same period. However, this estimate did not take into account an absolutely fundamental issue, which is the population increase caused by immigration. In other words, this estimate is already wrong before it is even implemented. Paraná, and especially Santa Catarina, have experienced population growth above the national average, largely driven by the migration of people from other states. From 2010 to 2022, the population of Santa Catarina increased by 21.8%, the second highest relative growth nationally. Just between the 2022 census and the 2024 estimate, Santa Catarina would have grown by 5.89%, surpassing 8 million inhabitants. State authorities attribute this boom to the appeal of its dynamic economy, jobs, safety, and quality of life, which have attracted migrants from various parts of Brazil, and, to a much lesser extent, also from abroad, from outside Brazil. Paraná also grew in the period from 2022 to 2024 by about 3.32%, surpassing 11.8 million residents and becoming the most populous state in the south, although its migration rate is more moderate than that of Santa Catarina. The interior of Paraná, especially the northern part of Paraná, is receiving a huge influx of people from the greater São Paulo region. And obviously this population influx puts pressure on the water systems due to the increased demand, because obviously more residents and economic activities increase the consumption of drinking water. But without proportional expansions in infrastructure, there's a risk of imbalance between water supply and demand. For example, coastal cities in Santa Catarina that have seen a population boom in the last decade, like Palosa, with 62% since 2010, Itajaí, with more than 44%, and Florianópolis with 27%, can't create water infrastructure at the same pace as their population growth. And the governments, both state and municipal, have encouraged this migration because they aim for higher tax revenue. Maringá itself decided to double its urban perimeter to meet the pressure from construction companies, and also with a huge campaign for years and years of being the best city in Brazil to attract people from outside, causing an increase in homeless people, irregular housing, and as a consequence, crime. Things that were non-existent before this population explosion. If you want to ruin your city, promoting it as the best place in the country is the best way. The second best way to destroy it, which is a consequence of the first, is giving in to the pressure from construction company cartels. This unplanned urban expansion and rapid migration is leading to the occupation of new urban areas without proper water planning. New neighborhoods require the extension of distribution networks and are often at higher altitudes or in places less favored by the current network, which then requires new reservoirs and pumping stations. This happened in metropolitan regions like Joinville in Santa Catarina and Curitiba in Paraná, which had to speed up system improvement projects to serve peripheral neighborhoods that were newly populated, leading to political conflicts over what should be prioritized. Because unlike what socialists and nationalists think, money is not something infinite. Because with limited resources, sectoral growth due to economic migration forces the state to set priorities. Municipalities in regions of relative scarcity will need to balance the allocation of water between human consumption and other uses, mainly between industry and agriculture. Because basically the big question is, what is more important? Water to maintain the economic activity that provides jobs, or water needed to sustain the people who work in these sectors? It's like that story about the short blanket. If you cover your feet, your chest is uncovered. If you pull the blanket up, your feet are left out. And Santa Catarina also faces difficulties in building large dams. The state is dominated by mountainous terrain and narrow valleys, especially in the interior and west of the state, and the construction of large dams is made difficult by the geological and topographical complexity, because these are narrow valleys that on one hand allow for deeper dams, but on the other hand also limit the extent of flooding and greatly increase engineering costs, since the dams would have to be tall and complex. Another problem is that most rivers in Santa Catarina, such as Uruguay, Chapaco, Itajaí, and Açu, Canoas, and Tubarão, have seasonal hydrological regimes, with intense floods, but also very severe droughts. And this instability makes it difficult to keep reservoirs at stable levels, and basically, everything gets messed up if we have prolonged periods of drought. Santa Catarina also has a high population density in small and medium-sized municipalities that are spread throughout almost its entire area. The most suitable places for building dams are exactly where these cities and the state's agricultural production are located. This means that creating large reservoirs would involve relocating cities, towns, and so on, causing enormous social impacts and overwhelming compensation costs. To make matters worse, some regions have soils that are susceptible to landslides and intense erosion processes, such as the Itajaí Valley region, which compromises the structural safety of dams. Geological stability is a fundamental requirement in large dam projects, and Santa Catarina has many areas with high vulnerability to mass movements. So we have an enormous risk of an unprecedented water crisis in these two states, Paraná and Santa Catarina. But the question that comes up is, how big is this risk? And the answer is that it depends on the continuation of migration. In terms of organic growth, that is, the birth rate of the local population itself, I'm not worried because the region is already at the level of a birth rate crisis. So the factor that will determine whether this region can break down or not will be the increase in migration. In 2025 and 2026, I believe the risk of a major collapse is under 10%. In other words, it's very unlikely because even though we already have some specific problems, the existing infrastructure still guarantees basic supply in most cities. But if the migration rate continues as it has so far, by 2030, then we'll have something around 50 to 60% chance, because the constant population growth will make the current and even the planned installed capacity unsustainable. Metropolitan regions like Curitiba, Joinville, Florianopolis, Londrina, and Chapecó would face permanent critical situations. Prolonged rationing would be frequent and widespread. But if the pace continues until 2040, we're talking about a 90% risk, an unsustainable scenario. Because if nothing is done by then, the water crisis will be total, inevitable, and permanent, especially in the most populated regions with permanent collapses, severe restrictions, and a continuous need for emergency supply by trucks, water imports, and so on. Things that are absolutely unfeasible on a large scale. We will have extremely serious economic and social impacts that will end up becoming structural and irreversible. Santa Catarina had a population growth of 5.89% between 2022 and 2024, as I mentioned just now, just like Paraná with 3.32%. If we maintain this average or even accelerate it, the urban population could increase by 25% to 35% by 2035, which is impractical. And considering the water atlas, about 52% of the cities in Paraná and 58% of the cities in Santa Catarina already have medium or low water security. With the constant increase in demand until 2035, about 80 to 90% of the cities could fall into the low or very low security category. So we're talking about a very high risk, since mayors and governors have been doing everything they can to increase the size of the cities, because that would increase tax revenue, in addition to meeting the enormous, gigantic, and intense pressure from construction companies. Now, if you ask me if this is inevitable, I have to say no. It's not an inevitable crisis, because it will strongly depend on the size of the immigrant population increase in these two states, and whether the governments will make the necessary reforms. That's because I'm not only skeptical that the governments will make all the investments they need to make, but also, even if they did, it would be based on outdated demand. In other words, the projects would already be obsolete before they're even completed. So it won't be the state that will have any role in solving this crisis, but rather the scale of immigration, because as we will see in this and the next decade, as violence increases, there will be a rise in immigrants fleeing violence, especially from Rio de Janeiro in the Northeast. This is something new for Brazil because historically, migrations in Brazil have always been for economic reasons and never to escape violence. We're basically talking about what is almost a war refugee. I say almost, because officially we don't have a war, although considering the state's absolute inability to deal with crime and sometimes even the government itself encouraging criminality, we have death tolls equal to those of countries at war. And as this gets worse, we'll see more and more immigrants because of violence. So in practice, it will be the same dynamic, just more silent. And this, combined with people who will flee from the major metropolitan areas closest to this region because of the high cost of living, will especially include immigrants from the greater São Paulo and greater Porto Alegre regions. There will be two very strong motivations that could overwhelm these two states. But ironically, the demographic crisis may end up reducing or even preventing this crisis. Because with the Brazilian population stagnating and already entering the demographic crisis, probably as early as 2030, and ignore that demographic update from Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics in mid-2024, which suddenly found another 10 million people in a rather suspicious way, maybe internal migration within Brazil to Paraná and Santa Catarina will end up slowing down. So, if human movement continues as it has over the last 20 years, we will have crises at the levels I mentioned. But if it decreases, it will depend on how much it decreases. In other words, that's why it's not something inevitable, but highly likely. We will depend more on luck than on the skill of public authorities, which, by the way, is normal in Brazil. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. And a special thank you to the super members Lucas Silva de Souza and As Portas da Tidade. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and follow us on Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok to stay up to date with the channel's news and geopolitics. And also share this video with everyone you know to help the Geopolitica Mundial channel keep growing. Your support is very important. Hugs and see you in the next video. Thank you.